Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Monday, September 25th, 2023. My name is Emma Vigeland in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Ahsan Butt, professor at George Mason University, on Trudeau accusing India of killing a Canadian citizen in Canada. And later in the show, Akela Lacy on the right-wing Israeli lobby targeting black Democrats in primaries. Meanwhile, Hollywood writers have reached a tentative agreement with the AMPTP after 146 days of striking. Details still coming out about that deal. A group of U.S. Postal Service rural carriers are collecting signatures to decertify their union after drastic reductions to their pay. The Republican effort to shut down the government continues to look more likely. Saturday is the deadline. Another scary poll. ABC Washington Post has Biden losing 51-42 in a head-to-head matchup with Trump. That is not ideal. This comes as GOP mega donors tell Politico that some are just basically giving up on funding alternates to Trump in the primary, given his massive lead. John Fetterman is the first Democratic senator to call for Menendez to resign amid corruption charges. Meanwhile, Representative Andy Kim announces a primary challenge to Menendez for 2024. Tyson Foods and Purdue Farms investigated by the Labor Department over child labor violations. That accounts for a third, the two of them, of U.S. poultry supply. It's a big deal. The Biden administration announces the allocation of $1.4 billion to improve U.S. railroads in 35 states. Thousands of Armenian refugees are fleeing after Azerbaijan seized disputed territory in fear of ethnic cleansing. Saudi Arabia sentences a 18-year-old girl to 18 years in prison over tweets criticizing the government.
Facebook turned over info in that case, I believe. Is that the one?
They did?
I think that's the one, yeah.
Lovely. And lastly, Macron says France will pull out its forces and its ambassadors from Niger following the coup. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Hello, everybody. Happy Yom Kippur to those who celebrate, and to Sam in absentia. He is out today, but he will be back tomorrow. He's celebrating the holidays, so happy holidays to everybody who does celebrate, including Sam. We are back. It's been a rainy, dreary weekend here in New York, and that always puts me a little bit behind in like my ability to speak coherently. So,
definitely, yeah. No,
yeah.
I love it. I love the rain.
I know, we were just chatting about that. I don't know why. It's like I can't, without the sun, my brain doesn't fully wake up. But hopefully the show, it'll get a little bit easier as we go along. Let's just dive right into the budget, or I should say the government funding debacle here. Saturday, the 30th, remains the deadline for the budget deal. They could, in theory, pass a continuing resolution, which is the short-term spending stopgap bill that you may have heard that term before in reference to these standoffs. In theory, they could pass one of those to punt it a month or two towards the end of the year to making these decisions, but there is a group of hardline freaks that include Matt Gaetz who refuse to do such a thing. We'll hear from him in a second, but on the other side of things, there are 18 House Republicans who are representing districts that Biden won in 2020. And those 18 Republicans are the subject of much pressure and focus by the Democrats in terms of getting them to be in uncomfortable positions, because their districts are not going to look too kindly upon the Republican Party shutting down the government over concerns that are both completely inauthentic and also so far from the mind of the average voter that it will not make a difference. I mean, Republicans are traditionally blamed, as they should be, for these government shutdown situations. They're also often blamed for their shenanigans when in the voting booths, I should say, blamed by voters for things like the impeachment inquiry into Bill Clinton, which most people thought was BS. I predict a very similar response to the efforts to impeach Biden over a crime that they haven't even been able to name as it relates to his son Hunter. They're just flailing here. They're in disarray, and McCarthy's speakership is certainly in question right now. And someone like Matt Gaetz here, he does not care, because he has no principles except for chaos and anti-government rhetoric. And if you don't like the government and you think the government should be hampered, then shutting it down, you have no ideological opposition to that. Even if a lot of people get hurt along the way, even if government workers stop receiving their paychecks for a period of time, even if there are hits to the economy, what have you. But Maria Bartiromo on her show on Fox had a monologue on her Sunday show speaking about the looming government shutdown. And she also spoke to Jim Jordan, who mentioned that he thinks that the Republicans should pass a continuing resolution, and then focus on just one area, the southern border, to negotiate with Democrats on. This was Gaetz's response, I think, later in that same show, after hearing what Bartiromo and Jordan had to say at the start of it. And this is just kind of how extreme he is. He's even further to the right and more nihilistic than Maria Bartiromo and Jim Jordan.
Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. Congressman, thank you very much for being here this morning.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad I get to respond to your monologue, because if you're saying that I'm standing in the way of all the Republican wins, I'd love you to enumerate them. Watching my friend and mentor Jim Jordan, it was quite painful, because he started by saying we should only pick one fight, the border. But then as the interview went on, he said, well, we should pick a second fight, Jack Smith. And by the time the interview rounded out, he was saying that we shouldn't be funding Ukraine without a plan. And yet the very continuing resolution that you and Jim Jordan seem to be for continues to have $300 million more for Ukraine. So I think we ought to fight on all fronts. I think the border is very important. And the best way for us to advance the Republican border policies is to pass the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Bill, do that along with veterans, defense, ag, state and foreign ops. We'll have 73% of the discretionary budget funded. And if, the Department of Labor and Education have to shut down for a few days as we get their appropriations in line, that's certainly not something that is optimal. But I think it's better than continuing on the current path we are to America's financial ruin.
Congressman, I understand, and that is why you are on this program this morning, because I want to give you a fair shot, and I want to get you heard. So tell me why you are threatening Speaker McCarthy and trying to shut down this government at a time that the Republicans have finally gotten some upper hands here in terms of wins, able to investigate President Biden on what looks like bribery.
Yeah, we don't put
Can you
our
pause that for a
pencils down
sec?
in the.
It's interesting. She must be close to somebody in the McCarthy orbit, because that's exactly what he would want to say publicly. The reason that they're doing this impeachment investigation into Biden is to attempt to appease the Gaetzes of the world.
Some red meat, yeah.
Right, and Gaetz is not having it.
They're McCarthy and Bartiromo are very close to the point where I don't know if you remember Tucker Carlson. There was a lot of speculation in their office that Bartiromo and McCarthy were having an affair.
Oh my God, was that from those texts?
Yeah.
I totally forgot about that. That explains. I mean, not that they're having an affair, but they're clearly close.
He goes on a lot. He has like priority, and she sort of really does hew to his line of thinking on a lot of this stuff.
That's very interesting because she's lying on his behalf there. I mean, that's
getting a Biden investigation is like giving the left oversight committee privileges. Like, oh, thanks, we can get some highlights out of this that go nowhere.
Right. So it's completely aesthetic, and McCarthy, thought and prayed really that would be enough to appease the hardliners, but they're not having it. And then they're not having it as well if he chooses to circumvent that group of 6 or so who are saying absolutely no and work with Democrats. Then they're saying that they would remove him from the speakership. So this is the kind of nonsense that like everybody is dealing with here. It's not a stretch to say that those members led by Gates, that handful of people or 2 handfuls, are holding the entire government hostage. But this is the Republicans. All right, keep going.
Some upper hands here in terms of wins, able to investigate President Biden on what looks like bribery.
Yeah, we don't put our pencils down in the investigation of President Biden during a shutdown, so the premise is false. Second, if Kevin McCarthy was actually serious about pursuing the Bidens, he would have sent Hunter Biden a subpoena by now. That's how you know this is sort of failure theater that you're observing. During the first year of Democrat control of the Congress, they brought in Donald Trump Jr. 3 times over a nothing burger. And so we seem to be fundamentally unserious in our oversight. But what is serious is the fact that we are spending more than $7 trillion a year, bringing in around $5 trillion a year. And I want to fund the government. I'm not pro-shutdown, but the way to fund the government is not the same way we've been doing it since the mid-90s, where it's one up or down vote on the entire government all at once. We should have separate single subject spending bills.
Taxes is how you fund the government. That's you want to balance the budget? It's fine. It's super simple. You raise taxes on the wealthy, and then we don't have to cut anything whatsoever, and we can fund all of the programs that we need to make people's lives easier, and then some. But they create a completely false premise of what we can do or can't do. It's either cut spending, or we're on the road to fiscal irresponsibility. How about we raise taxes and then we don't have to do anything of the sort? But the problem here is that McCarthy, in theory, at least signed off on this agreement in May as a part of the debt ceiling bill, which put in place this framework for the negotiations surrounding the budget a few months later. And there were all of these kind of triggers in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is what they ended up calling it, when Biden worked with Republicans on this matter to get them to pass these appropriations bills and not just do continuing resolutions. And it cuts both ways a bit, but the reality is that they're not close to passing any of that dozen of appropriations bills. They're not close in any manner. And so if the continuing resolution is off the table, that means a shutdown is essentially imminent. And look, it's the Freedom Caucus that forced McCarthy into a position where he reneged on that deal. And since they were the ones who were liars, Biden should not work with them on this whatsoever. He already worked with them on the debt ceiling when we didn't even need to do so. They could have you could have forced the Republicans into an uncomfortable position there. Now, especially when they're trying to demand all of these cuts, do not work with them on anything. Give them enough rope to hang themselves and have them hash this out. Because the more chaos that's in the Republican Party, the better that is for the Democratic Party, especially when you have Biden at the top of the ticket, who doesn't inspire anything in the average voter. I think if I were to guess right now, if it's Trump versus Biden in 2024, the negative partisanship about Trump, I would hope, is enough to carry Biden over the finish line. But Biden should not take that for granted by any means. That's why it's a good thing that he's going to the picket lines tomorrow to support UAW workers. And it would be a good thing for him to promote chaos within the Republican Party. They're already doing a good job of it themselves. The Freedom Caucus is refusing to engage with anything involving a short-term spending gap, a continuing resolution. And that's part of what Gaetz was responding to there in relation to Jim Jordan's comments. But even the proposed continuing resolutions from these Republicans would die in the Senate, which is controlled by Democrats. So it really is a complete mess at this point, and it's a mess of the Republicans doing. It's important that the Democratic Party communicate that to the public. All right, guys. One word from our sponsors before we get to Ahsan. Nutrafol. You don't have to choose between better hair growth and your health. And now I know a lot of people, guys in particular, who get started on some of these medications that you have to take basically for the rest of your life, or the hair starts to fall out and there are some side effects that people don't really like. This is not that. Nutrafol is not a drug. It is basically a supplement to promote better hair. No drugs, no compromises, just better hair. Nutrafol is the #1 dermatologist recommended hair growth supplement, clinically shown to improve your hair growth, visible thickness, and visible scalp coverage. Nutrafol's hair growth supplements use physician-formulated, natural, science-backed ingredients. Their drug-free, patented technology provides consistent, reliable results without compromising your sexual health. That is definitely one of the side effects that I've heard about for some of those drugs. Nutrafol is not that. And by the way, I know a woman, a friend of a friend, who had a bunch of health issues, lost a lot of her hair, and she started taking Nutrafol, the women's version, and her hair grew back, which is, amazing. Go to Nutrafol.com/men to take their hair health wellness quiz. Identify causes of your thinning hair, and Nutrafol will give you a personalized plan for better hair health through whole body wellness. Nutrafol supports healthy hair growth from within by targeting root causes of thinning, such as stress, hormones, environment, nutrition, lifestyle, and metabolism through whole body health. And it works. In a clinical study, 84% of men showed improvements in their hair after 6 months of taking Nutrafol men's hair growth supplements. Take the first step to visibly thicker, healthier hair. For a limited time, Nutrafol is offering our listeners $10 off your first month subscription and free shipping when you go to Nutrafol.com/men and enter the promo code TMR. Again, that's Nutrafol.com/men. Enter the promo code TMR for $10 off your first month subscription. Find out why over 4,000 healthcare providers, and professionals, I should say, recommend Nutrafol for healthier hair. Nutrafol.com/men, spelled Nutrafol.com/men, and enter promo code TMR. That's Nutrafol.com/men, promo code TMR. We'll put a link to that wherever you're listening to or watching this. All right, guys, quick break. And when we come back, we'll be talking to Ahsan Butt, Associate Professor of International Relations at George Mason University, about what is happening between Canada and India right now. We are back, and we are joined now by Ahsan Butt, Associate Professor of International Relations at George Mason University, author of Secession and Security, Explaining State Strategies Against Separatists. Ahsan, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So, of course. Basically, big picture, what happened when in the last week with Justin Trudeau making a explosive allegation that I don't think you would make unless you had extensive evidence to support it. But that's my editorial opinion on that, about essentially the Indian government's complicity in the killing of a Sikh Canadian citizen in a suburb of Vancouver. That's just kind of the headline. But what are the facts on the ground here?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have them basically accurate. What happened here is that Trudeau got up in front of the Canadian Parliament and made this, as you said, sort of explosive allegation. And yeah, right now we're in the stage of sort of seeing the aftermath of that allegation and how exactly the Indian government is going to respond. It actually hasn't made an official response as yet. It's been about a week. But yeah, the background here is basically, there's a couple of factors you want to keep in mind. One, at a structural level, India's rise in global power politics, and its belief that if other powerful countries can murder people outside their borders for all sorts of reasons, then why can't they do it? So that's sort of one angle here. The other angle here is obviously we want to keep in mind the substantive issue itself, which is the issue of Khalistan and sort of Sikh separatism in the Indian state of Punjab. Ironically, the Khalistan issue is probably not a big issue today. It was a very, very big issue in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s when the Indian government fought a very brutal civil war against Sikh separatists in Punjab. But the violence in that province and that conflict has essentially died down for the best part of a quarter century. So, and in many respects, the Khalistan issue is much more alive outside India than inside India, in places like Canada, the US, and UK. So the Indian government in the last few years has taken a more strident tone against people that it considers sort of enemies of the state, and both within the country and outside the country. And so we can think of this assassination, if indeed the allegation is correct, which I think we both probably assume is the case. If the allegation is correct, it marks a new, I would say, stage in India's development as a global power.
You mentioned the Khalistan movement. Could you give a bit more history for our audience on Sikh separatist movements within India and how that kind of cultural cachet, or not, maybe not even cachet, but just that history is so embedded in the accusation here?
Yeah, I mean, we'd want to step back and think about sort of how, well, there's a couple of ways to approach this. One is to think about India as a sort of very, sort of this hotbed of separatism, and that if you look at data sets on secessionism and separatism, India is the one country most affected by separatist movements throughout its history. And there's sort of two or three sort of hotbed regions of separatism in India. One would be the Northeast historically, and then one would be the sort of Northwest with Kashmir and then Punjab as well. So India has always tended to react quite violently, especially to separatist movements on its western border, those close to Pakistan, where Pakistan has had some sort of connection, especially in the case of Kashmir, but also in Punjab. The Khalistan issue really comes about, as I said, in the 70s and 80s. There's sort of historical reasons, everything to do with sort of the Green Revolution. Punjab is a very agriculture and farming heavy province. So developments in irrigation and agricultural science and so on in the Green Revolution in the 70s really set the stage for a more vociferous demand for Sikh nationalism, along with rising sort of religious extremism within the Sikh community in the early 80s, especially in the face of sort of Indian managing of that crisis, all of which led to this very, very famous incident in 1984 where the Indian government stormed the Golden Temple, which is a very, very sort of sacrilegious site for the Sikh community. And thousands of people died in the ensuing riots. Indira Gandhi, who was the Indian Prime Minister, was assassinated by her two Sikh bodyguards, who themselves were then shot, which then kicked off this sort of very vicious insurgency and then in turn counterinsurgency from like roughly the mid-80s to the early 90s. So that's really the sort of background to the conflict. But as I said, that conflict as an insurgency, counterinsurgency dynamic has been dead for 25 years. And if anything, the Modi government has given more oxygen to the movement, I would argue, by actually bringing it back to the fore in this manner.
Well, so then it makes the claims that Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who is the leader who was assassinated, the Canadian citizen, it makes the claims that he was a terrorist to be even more laughable, I guess, because if this, taking what you're saying, has essentially been a non-issue and is a bit more in the rearview mirror since the 80s and early 90s, how could they be just a few years ago charging him as a terrorist under this Indian law that, by my understanding, doesn't allow for really like any trial or due process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is where the rubber meets the road on this allegation. So the Indian government has, or supporters of the Indian government, because the Indian government hasn't said anything, but supporters of the Indian government have essentially made two counterclaims in response to the Trudeau allegation. One is, we didn't do it, so show us evidence that we did it. But then the sort of second one, which is kind of contradictory, is, okay, but even if we did do it, we're totally justified because he's a terrorist, as you said. So that sort of the sort of first allegation that he's a terrorist is, I think, really the one where the rubber meets the road, because so far anyway, outside India, I have only seen him referred to as a quote-unquote activist, a dissident, a leader, but not crucially a terrorist. And so the Indian government has to sort of convince the outside world that in fact he is tied up in terrorist activities, which so far, no one seems to be buying that logic other than people already inside India, and other than people already predisposed to believing what the Modi government has to say. So in my opinion, and of course opinions can change with new facts on the ground, but in my opinion, it's not clear to me that he was a terrorist. He was certainly a separatist, like he wanted an independent Khalistan, and he was politicking for that in Canada, which he's legally allowed to do. But I don't know if the mere act of calling for Khalistan makes one a terrorist. The Indian government is alleging that he's had his hand in certain acts of violence, in a particular cinema or in a particular murder, but the allegations sort of are not clear to me. Sometimes they change, and what the evidence is for those allegations is also not clear to me. So yeah.
Well, can I just interrupt quickly
please.
too as well? He became a Canadian citizen, so if he was this kind of globe-trotting terrorist out of a Bourne movie, it's pretty difficult in like some of these countries like the United States and Canada to get citizenry, and you have to go through an extensive process. They might have caught that part if that were the case.
Absolutely. And the Indian government has been sort of raising concerns about not just this gentleman, but a lot of people like him and a lot of networks that, he is embedded in, and the types of networks that someone like him would be embedded in. Again, not just in Canada, but also in places like the US, UK, and even Australia, which is really where the Sikh movement is probably the strongest. So yeah, absolutely, you're right that if there was like a very strong sort of evidentiary trail of him being tied up either directly in military training activities or even financing terrorism, that the Canadian government would presumably take that very seriously. So the fact that they haven't sort of gone after him or prosecuted him suggests to me that the Indian government's allegation that he's a terrorist is probably spurious.
How does this fit into Modi's larger, as the leader of the most populous country in the world at this point, his broader history and record of human rights violations? Infamously, as the minister of Gujarat, he gave carte blanche for the killing of Muslims. Recently, obviously, we've covered this on the show before, the way he's oppressed Kashmir and cut off internet access. And he's just been notorious as one of the most powerful leaders in the country in the world, I should say, who is also quite bigoted towards other groups and chooses to engage in that bigotry by using state power to repress them. This is very much in keeping, I would say, with Modi's record on these matters.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of angles to highlight there. I think one is sort of the state power in international relations angle, which is, India's a rising power, and Modi's particular brand of muscular nationalism, sort of Hindu nationalism, is very keen to assert India's place in the world, India's new place in the world, as a rising power. And so one way of thinking about this act and other similar sort of rhetorical, devices to this end has been, that this is emblematic of Modi and his government's view of India's place in the world and asserting that place in the world. So that's one issue. The other issue in terms of what you're talking about, sort of bigotry and repression, especially to minorities, I mean, the point is well taken given Modi's record, especially on Muslims. The one sort of caveat I would highlight here is that the Sikh religion and Sikh minorities can, it would be a stretch to sort of put them in the same category as like the Kashmir issue or the Muslim minority. For historical reasons, the Sikh community has always been much closer to the sort of Hindu mainstream than others, and even geographically, Punjab is much closer to Delhi, the capital, than a place like the Northeast or Kashmir. And so even cognitively, Punjabi Sikhs are considered sort of closer to the Indian mainstream. So I don't know if sort of a religious repression angle per se is the one I would adopt necessarily, but certainly the idea of, Modi asserting India's place in the world and saying we're not going to brook any sort of dissent, whether it's within the country or outside the country, I think that's probably the angle I would adopt.
Well, it's also helpful to look at his actions in the same context as Mohammed bin Salman's assassination alleged of Jamal Khashoggi, and the fact that the United States essentially turned a blind eye to that despite Biden's protestations on the campaign trail. We can also talk about Netanyahu and the way that the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh has been papered over by the U.S. And now I'm looking at it through that context as well, because my next question to you is the United States' muted reaction on this front. Like, the U.S. clearly values India as an important rival against China, which is their primary concern. And we just had Matt Duss on the program on Friday, who said it's quite clear that the Biden administration's foreign policy is tethered to this central rivalry with China, and that's driving so much of what they're doing. Your just assessment of the United States' reaction or lack thereof on this front, and how that relates to broader attempts to kind of forge these deep economic ties with India.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, the U.S. is sort of caught between the devil and deep blue sea on this, right? Yeah, on the one hand, they certainly don't want to be seen as putting too much distance between themselves and India. India is considered, a very, very important player in that rivalry with China. And India itself, is very, very, what we would call sort of displays a sort of a prickly nationalism, in the sense that it's very sensitive to outside criticism. And so to the extent that successive U.S. governments from the Obama administration on, obviously not counting the Trump administration because they didn't care about human rights, but both the Obama and Biden administrations, to the extent that they have made demands, or maybe not even demands, but sort of raise concerns over the issue of human rights, they've done so in private. They're very, very careful to not sort of castigate India in public. So that's sort of one constraint. But on the other side, Canada is a very, very long-standing partner of the U.S. I mean, Canada fights with the U.S. in every single war that it fights. Canada supports the U.S. in every single Security Council resolution. Especially the super controversial ones, with on Israel, for example. The Canada is one of the few countries that always votes in step with the U.S. And not to mention the sort of military security alliance in terms of the Five Eyes intelligence cooperation network. So, Canada is a long-standing friend of the U.S., and that's why I think we're seeing sort of that the tension between these two constraints sort of result in this sort of, as you say, a muted reaction. But I wouldn't go that far. I mean, to the extent that the U.S. government has made statements in the aftermath of this, as you said, very explosive allegation, from Secretary of State Blinken, from the White House spokesman Jake Sullivan, both have sort of clarified that, to the extent that the U.S. can say anything right now, it's siding with Canada. It obviously doesn't want to say anything too over the top, but its words make clear that it cares a lot about the fact that the Indian government has done this. And the last thing I'll say is, just compared to, Khashoggi and some of the other cases that you mentioned, all well and good. I totally understand how that can sort of seem like a precedent, both to sort of observers and, more importantly, to the Indian government itself. I guess the big distinction between those cases and this one is that the act was carried out against a Western citizen in the Western country itself. And so that is sort of, different from some of the other cases you mentioned. And so that's why I think this allegation has brought, so much attention.
Fair enough. Well said on that front. You mentioned a bit about how the Indian government has not formally responded to this, but a lot of the supporters of Modi and that government have been speaking out. What has been the reaction within India to these allegations?
Yeah, it's a mix of defensiveness with sort of, so as I said, one version of the response is, hey, we didn't do it. Show us the evidence. You were wrong about WMD in Iraq as well. So why should we believe anything Western intelligence agency says? The second reaction has been to say, sort of this O.J. Simpson, if I did, even if we did it, we were justified, and for all the reasons that we were talking about. And then the third reaction is sort of this domestic political reaction, which is, by doing this, you have just ensured Modi's re-election because, he's seen to be, this powerful leader who can take care of Indian enemies abroad. And so it's a reaction of defensiveness, of pride, of an assertion of power. I don't think that the Indian government right now, so that's a public reaction. What we don't know is what's happening behind closed doors. A couple of sort of sources that I trust have said something to the effect of, have written something to the effect of, the Indian government is being a little bit more conciliatory behind closed doors than it is in public. Obviously, we don't know that for sure, but certainly the public reaction has been quite, dismissive of Trudeau and his allegation.
And then I guess that brings us to the other leader involved here, Justin Trudeau. I mean, what is the relationship between Trudeau in this way and the, say, Sikh? I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there's a significant amount of number of people who are Sikh diaspora in Canada, and so that's like a bit of a domestic concern for him. But what is your assessment of his role here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, by a percentage of population, Sikhs are actually a bigger percentage of Canada's population than India's population. They're roughly 2%. That's roughly 2% of Canada's population, and roughly 1.5% of India's population. And in pure numbers, Canada has the second largest Sikh population in the world after India. So yeah, Sikhs are an important sort of part of the fabric of Canadian society and Canadian politics. One of Canada's three main parties is now led by a Sikh. And Trudeau himself was very proud and advertised the fact that his cabinet, for instance, had more Sikhs in it than Modi's cabinet did, and he had, more women in it. And so, he's been very, very he's used the fact of sort of having minority representation in Canadian politics as a point of pride. And yeah, certainly, what Indians derisively refer to as "quote unquote" vote bank politics, the idea that you say and do certain things to elicit the support of particular groups of people for votes, I think might be overstated, but there is some kernel of truth there in the sense that he's a Democratic politician and he needs to win votes, and they're an important constituency. Although, as I said, the extent to which they're an important constituency might be overstated in a lot of the Indian media I'm seeing. So yeah, I think so. Trudeau has a domestic political angle here as well. But the one thing I'd say is most of the across the Canadian political spectrum, we've seen some pretty uniform support for Trudeau and his allegations. This sort of seems to be a closing of the ranks, which itself I think is reflective of, number one, the intelligence behind the allegation. My suspicion is that it's very, very good, strong intelligence. And number two, I think it says something about how the Canadian body politic is thinking about this, which is, we are going to be united on this front, come what may, when it comes to outside actors. Like, we can't let sort of divisions within us be exploited by people outside.
This is a really important story that we're going to be monitoring going forward. I really appreciate your time today, Ahsan, Associate Professor of International Relations at George Mason. The book that you authored a few years ago, Secession and Security, Explaining States' Strategy Against Separatists. We'll put a link to that in the description wherever you're listening to or watching this. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are back, and we are joined now by Akela Lacy, politics reporter at The Intercept, whose latest piece is entitled AIPAC Targets Black Democrats While the Congressional Black Caucus Stays Silent. Akela, welcome back to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Emma. Great to be here.
So AIPAC is ramping up its efforts to challenge progressive Democrats throughout the country. And that also includes members of the Congressional Black Caucus, some of whom are now, members of the Squad or Squad adjacent, Ilhan Omar or Jamal Bowman, who have been critical of the Israeli, apartheid regime and all that it entails. So, I mean, talk a bit about that tension as well, the connection with the CBC to AIPAC, and now these kind of newer, more leftist members being a part of the Congressional Black Caucus and lead a bulk of the CBC basically being silent about these well-funded efforts to dislodge them.
Yeah, so there's a couple of important pieces here. One, that as Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, and Summer Lee have joined the Congressional Black Caucus since 2018, they have represented sort of a new and growing wing of progressives in the caucus, which is otherwise, there are a lot of more senior members who fall on the more moderate side. And lots of CBC, either current or former leadership, have extremely close ties with AIPAC, whether that's, leading congressional delegations by AIPAC to Israel every year, speaking at the annual AIPAC conference, or attending other events. And also now that AIPAC has started giving directly to federal candidates, this was back in 2021, supplanting some of its lobbying efforts. Those members are, they still have a very strong relationship with AIPAC. In the story, we reported that the members of the CBC, I think 31 members have taken at least $3.6 million from AIPAC since early 2021. So that's, less than 2 years. That's a lot of money to take in less than 2 years. And at the same time, AIPAC has been very aggressively targeting several CBC members. They spent a lot of money to try to stop Summer Lee from being elected last year. I think it was more than $6 million on her race alone. They also spent money in Ilhan Omar's primary last year to support her opponent, Don Samuels. She was obviously reelected. And then there's been reporting in the last 2 months that AIPAC has been specifically recruiting challengers to Omar, Bowman, and Summer Lee ahead of 2024. So we decided, we should ask CBC if they want to comment on this. The other important piece here is that CBC members have been very vocal against efforts to primary their members in the past, some of which were, actually by some of these members, Cori Bush. CBC backed a white Ayanna Pressley's white opponent back in 2018 over her when she was primarying him. And then there was even some reporting early last year that they had encouraged Mondaire Jones to primary Jamal Bowman in his reelection and amid all the crazy redistricting stuff that was happening in New York. And they've also been very staunch supporters of protecting incumbents, not in this case necessarily. So yeah, we asked them to comment on this and they did not.
Well, I mean, that's the lack of comment is not necessarily surprising, but I mean, this is very much in keeping with some of their inconsistencies, as you mentioned. The fact that their excuse in the past for not supporting Black candidates, and whether Black candidates like Ayanna Pressley, right? Even, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, were they kind of silent when Eliot Engel was being challenged as well? I'm not exactly sure. I don't want to go ahead.
Yeah, so you're asking, was the CBC silent?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember exactly. I'm not exactly sure. They did not support Bowman in that race. I know that. And obviously AIPAC spent a lot of money to support Engel. Sorry, that's actually not correct. But there was a lot of Republican support for Eliot Engel's campaign. And yeah, CBC did not come to support Bowman in that race. Yeah.
So in those are just two examples of races where there was a black person running, a black progressive running in that race, and they did not weigh in, or they endorsed the opponent in the instance of the Ayanna Pressley race because, we support our incumbents. That has been kind of the party line for the Democratic Party, whether it's the Congressional Black Caucus, whether it's Pelosi weighing in on races as in her time as the leader of the Democrats in the House. Like, we back our incumbents, except when we don't. And this appears to be, at the very least, an example of that dynamic, if you don't mind fleshing out some of the inconsistencies there.
Yeah. So, just one example that we highlight in the story, Hakeem Jeffries leading the Democratic caucus, longtime member of the CBC, in line potentially to be the first Black Speaker of the House, has been one of the most vocal, supporters of protecting incumbents, and the importance of doing that for the caucus and the party overall. He started a PAC last year called Team Blue PAC with Josh Gottheimer, Terry Sewell, to, basically spend money to support incumbents who are facing primary challengers from their left. Jeffries, in this case, only after being approached by media with the news that AIPAC was recruiting challengers to Ilhan Omar, has come out and endorsed her. But his office would not say whether he has plans to endorse Jamal Bowman or Summer Lee. So that's one piece. And, just another fun tidbit on Team Blue PAC and Josh Gottheimer's involvement there. Josh Gottheimer has also been obviously not a member of the CBC, but has been very vocally, opposed to some of the squad members. He, gave a comment to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, which is on strike right now. So he crossed the picket line basically to criticize Summer Lee in an interview to them last
Why
month.
was he giving an interview to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette as a representative in New Jersey, except to just literally target Summer Lee, that's where her district is, Pittsburgh, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Saying, that she didn't do enough to denounce anti-Semitism. This was after there was this vote, to declare that Israel is not racist or an apartheid state. So anyway, that's just an aside there. And then, the other member, Greg Meeks, Stephen Horsford, these are folks who have all sort of been part of this chorus of we need to protect our incumbents. This is the most important thing. Some of the top recipients of AIPAC money, and they have not, said anything about the attempts to primary some of these members. And also, just to add, this was an inconsistency back when there were only a couple of progressive members in the squad, but now we're talking about they represent, 5 members of the CBC. This is not an insignificant number of people, in a situation where the House has a very slim, if it wins back the House, Democrats win back the House in 2024, they would have a very slim majority. So even if it's, beyond, you disagree with their politics or their approach, if the overall goal that they've been stating, which is to protect the Democratic majority, if that's still the stated goal, then as the number of progressives grow in the CBC and the silence, they continue to be silent on efforts to primary them, that's also putting the majority at risk. And
it just is a part of a consistent through line of frustration with the Congressional Black Caucus's kind of stated principles and what they actually behave or endorse in practice, which is a just more corporate-friendly wing of the Democratic Party. And if you don't mind just talking a bit more about that recent history and how it really is bumping up against this new wave of progressive representatives who are people of color or are women. In Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib's case, they're Muslim women, bringing a diversity of voices to Congress that also aligns with progressive values that include opposing Israeli apartheid, which AIPAC is trying to beat back. But, it's not just the opposition to what Israel is doing. I think it's also about what that says about what you're going to stand for in Congress. Like, if you are brave enough to speak out against the right-wing Israeli lobby, which AIPAC is so representative of, that means you're probably also going to support a bunch of taxes on the wealthy. You're also going to support a higher minimum wage. You're going to support issues that threaten a ton of moneyed interests in this country. Just the intersection of those incentives, if you don't mind talking a bit about that.
Totally. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right. You're hitting the nail right on the head. The sort of old guard, versus progressive dynamic in the CBC is salient in issues outside of Israel politics, outside of foreign policy. CBC leadership and some of the old guard members are, they take excessive amounts of corporate PAC money. They're not necessarily the people leading the charge on any of the issues in the Democratic caucus, for that matter. These are people who are sort of sitting on the sidelines, towing the party line. And despite having, a unique position to be able to sort of lead on issues, particularly issues, of importance to Black voters, minorities of other minority voters, working class voters, CBC leadership is not leading the discussion on those issues. I think the corporate PAC money thing is probably the most visible difference between the quote unquote old guard and some of these newer members. But I think the more interesting thing is sort of like the lack of activity that you see from these members on anything. I think it's one thing. One piece is, yes, they're taking a lot of money from people. The other piece is they have some of them who've been in office, for 4+ terms, are in a position where they have, a lot of support from their bases in their respective districts. And they're in a position where they don't necessarily have to, stick their neck out on anything or really lead or do much of anything at all in Congress. And that is a way for them to, sort of keep their seat, keep their tenure, ensure that they're going to be reelected again in the next year. And part of that is, making sure that they have sort of full coffers, whether that's from AIPAC or from any of these sort of other corporate donors that support them.
And at least that AIPAC is not spending against them or recruiting people to challenge you, as they have been doing actively based on your reporting in the case of Summer Lee. And that seems like a interestingly timed interview with Josh Gottheimer, who has spearheaded efforts to basically get the left, more leftist members out of Congress. That does not seem like a coincidence to me, but we'll put that aside for a second because I want to talk a bit about Hakeem Jeffries.
Yes.
He is one of the top recipients in the Congressional Black Caucus of AIPAC money since 2022. He is also the House Democratic Caucus leader, and he's Nancy Pelosi's handpicked successor in that way. Part of what the Democratic Party sees as valuable in that kind of position is the ability to fundraise. Nancy Pelosi is one of the best fundraisers in the Democratic Party, and that's in part why she, I think, retained her position for so long. And Jeffries is hoping for a similarly long tenure, which is probably, a part of why he's not going to publicly go after a group like AIPAC. Let alone he's cozied up to them with public comments and in practice with them funding him.
Yeah, and this is sort of emblematic of this split, right? Like earlier this year when progressive members, other members who were not necessarily in the squad, were protesting Israel's president's address to Congress, saying that they weren't going to attend this speech, particularly while there's this right-wing attack on Israel's judiciary, in addition to, all the sort of ongoing issues of the apartheid state there. Jeffries was preparing to lead, AIPAC's annual delegation to Israel. This is also at a time when, this was at the sort of the height of the, quote unquote migrant crisis in New York, when migrants were sleeping on the streets. And so people were kind of like, okay, why, you're a congressman from New York, you're the next in line to lead the Democratic Party, but for some reason at this really important time, you're at this really important time in New York, and this time when there's all this vocal criticism of Israel, particularly with the president coming, you're still leading the annual delegation there. And what does that say about the relationship that you have with AIPAC, the priorities that your office has? That was something that a lot of sources were asking me about at that time, and that was highly covered, right? But again, there's not. Hakeem Jeffries is in a sort of unique position where he can get away with not answering to that stuff because he does have this position of power within the caucus already. And it's sort of this catch-22 where people are like, okay, well, if we want a chance at winning back the majority, if we want to keep somebody who has strong fundraising prowess in this position, then he's our best bet, right? And so all these other things can go by the wayside. At least I think that's we have a quote from a Democratic strategist in the story sort of about this tension with CBC beyond some of the AIPAC stuff, that a lot of what's driving this beyond the money from AIPAC is that they have this idea that if they do criticize the Israel lobby, it's not only cutting off a potential source of fundraising, but it's jeopardizing the potential to have Jeffries, as the first Black Speaker of the House, and what that would mean for the caucus and for the CBC more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, and it just seems like incredibly short-sighted in like their in what they're attempting to promote. And I mean, before I let you go, just the fact that the CBC or members of the CBC reportedly wanted Mondaire Jones to challenge Bowman last year, that was a result of a horrific redistricting process that even had to happen, that the New York Democratic Party completely dropped the ball on, and then Sean Patrick Maloney big dogged his way into it was Mondaire Jones's district, right, Bradley? Yes. Yeah. Sean Patrick Maloney forcing him to look elsewhere to run, and dividing two Black members against one another. And now Mondaire Jones is out of Congress. And like the fact that there were members of the Congressional Black Caucus actively pushing pitting against one another of two Black members because they both happen to be Bowman's more progressive and Mondaire Jones is as well, but less to I would say much less of an extent than Jamal Bowman, especially when it comes to something like Israel. Like, that is deeply troubling, and also just goes to show that their stated goals of expanding Black representation in Congress, it's secondary to a lot of other incentives, to put it mildly.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, so this was first reported by New York Magazine last year, and it was like this interesting tidbit that I had screenshotted like on my desktop for a year, because I was like, there's going to be another time for us to sort of go back and dig into what that means. And what it says about the broader caucus. I think, and it's also it's emblematic of the fact that the Black Caucus does not get a lot of scrutiny on this stuff. I mean, that was like a one line in a New York Mag piece a year ago. They didn't really get a lot of scrutiny for the fact that they backed, Ayanna Pressley's incumbent white challenger over her. There isn't a lot, and I think this goes to the point that we were making earlier, that despite sort of all this prestige and
the numbers, like there is like there's strength in numbers in the way that they would promote the CBC, right? Yeah,
right. And discussion about sort of respect for the elders in the caucus and respect for the seniority that they have there. For all of that talk and for all of all the fanfare of it was their legislative caucus week last week, and like my Instagram feed is full of like all these swanky parties that they're holding and stuff. For all of that, there's not really much attention to the substance of what they're doing, or what positions they're taking to actually expand, or in this case shrink the caucus, right? So yeah, it's just it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, when you say the seniority and the influence there, I mean, it's been well documented, even though he's not the chair, but the Jim Clyburn's influence in the CBC is strongly felt, and given like his prominence in leadership, right. you could draw that connection. Is it fair to say that a lot of this is fish rotting from the head down, I guess, with like some of the kind of infrastructure that old guard Democrats like Clyburn have put in place?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's too far-fetched necessarily. I think there's a lot of sort of deference to tradition and, you know, paying your dues to members who paved the way before you. And part of the reason that there's so much animosity towards, you know, some of the folks coming in is not necessarily because they have different policy preferences, but it's because they don't follow those rules. And they're showing that you don't necessarily have to follow those rules to be elected to Congress or to join the CBC. And that threatens, you know, this power structure that has governed the caucus for, you know, decades at this point. And so that leaves members thinking, okay, well, what are we going to do? And realizing that there is sort of a burgeoning group of voters that don't necessarily subscribe to those traditions and you know, paying your dues and deferring to more senior members, and where does that leave them, you know, when their next reelection is around the corner?
Well, Akela Lacy, politics reporter at The Intercept. The piece is called AIPAC Targets Black Democrats While the Congressional Black Caucus Stays Silent. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Emma. Great to see you.
Great to see you as well. All right, with that, we are going to wrap up the first hour of this program, the free part of the program, and head into the fun half, where the number is 646-257-3920. Matt, what is happening on Left Reckoning?
Yeah, Left Reckoning, we had a clip show, patreon.com/says Left Reckoning, talking about, I can't even remember what we talked about on Sunday. Just slipped my mind. But we're talking with Jacob with the Valley Labor Report tomorrow about Union Joe hitting the picket line. That's
love to see
that's
it.
all tomorrow apparently. So we're going to talk about some different things, maybe some well, I don't want to get too juicy into it, but there might be a little bit of inner left drama stuff we talk about in regards to different critiques of the UAW and how credible those are. But patreon.com/says Left Reckoning tomorrow night, 7 p.m.
You know what I'm realizing is that we did not headline that Biden was joining the picket line, because that broke right after the show on Friday. Yeah. But for all of you still listening, massive news. I guess I had just thought that we had headlined it because it
the Friday news dump.
We did hear it on Friday.
You should probably tell us that. Like, don't put that in the Friday news dump. That's the sort of thing you want to let people
I know,
get into their news coverage.
But they're always running scared from narratives. That's that appears to be the Biden administration way. However, this is like a really good thing. I was seeing there were questions about whether or not a president has ever joined a picket line, and historians caution, based on like what I read, that there could have been an instance that we don't know about, but at least in the modern history over the past few decades, this is fairly unprecedented.
Yeah, I mean, the closest thing I can think of is during the New Deal era, FDR was saying things like, if I was a worker, I would join a union, which, you know, I think Biden has also kind of hinted at that sort of thing. And you know, I'd prefer the New Deal type of political economy to be instituted than different sort of stunts from the lead executive. But as far as it goes, I absolutely welcome it, and that's the type of thing that it's a sign of where power can be. Like, Joe Biden is doing this because the labor movement made a liability for him by saying, hey, if you want our endorsement, you're going to have to earn it. And if he didn't do anything to earn it, it'd be a problem. So I think there is a lesson there.
And on ESPN today, obviously, we're going to be talking about the record-breaking performance by the Miami Dolphins, Josh McDaniels being the worst, and the Minnesota Vikings completely imploding, but maybe it's a good thing for them long-term. YouTube.com/ESPN show today.
It's also the Vikings, so that's the sort of thing they do. Yeah. And I just remembered also, we talked about AOC and her Venezuela comments, which Juan Guaido has taken exception to on Twitter and at very long length.
I was excited to talk about that in the fun half, so we will, now that you've had a trial run, you can inform me on some of that stuff when we comment on her comments, which are incredibly welcome. Much appreciated for her to say that on Face the Nation. So yeah, check out ESPN, check out Left Reckoning. Also, just wanted to say and like give support to Matt Christman and everybody over at Chapo Trap House. Some news, from the Chapo team broke on Friday that Matt Christman experienced a severe health episode, and I know that his partner just gave birth to their baby. So
they actually did give birth.
I saw on social media, so that's really, glad that she's okay, and then the child is healthy. It seems, at least from social media. I don't have any knowledge, just
right.
Horrible timing, but hoping and praying for Matt and making that he makes a full recovery in this way.
Yeah, that's what the indications are. Hopeful that maybe he'll make a full recovery. Chrisman, I don't, like you said, I'm not friends with these people, but I've met Chrisman a handful of times, like in this studio and maybe at live events. He's an extremely genuine and nice guy, and horrible coincidental major life events happening where you'd have a major health event and then the birth of a child. So yeah. And I love all the Chapo guys. So
yeah, exactly. So sending all of our love and energy to making sure Matt feels better. All right, guys. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
You are in for it. All right, folks. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half. Oh, no. Oh, no.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Anarchy. Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just wanna degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it to my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman!
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder, what a fucking nightmare!
Bring back DJ.
Yeah, or a couple of them, just put them in rotation.
DJ Danner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense. See white people doing drugs, they look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males,
psych, fuck them.
Snowflake says what? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. Okay, I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. All lives matter.
Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are black. And the Africans are back.
When you see Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keeping it 100. Can't knock the hustle. Come on, fuck 'em. Things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday. Happy birthday to me, Jew boy.
I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are black. Africans are back.
Come on. Come on. Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
We are back, and it is the fun half, everybody, and we have opened up the phone lines. Let's just start right there, right off the bat. 646-257-3920 is the number. Calling from a 760 area code. 760, who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hello, Emma. This is Dan from Oceanside.
Dan from Oceanside, did you say?
Yep, Oceanside, California.
Oh,